History remembers saints and sinners, but between them lie those burned alive for simply being loved. In the heart of medieval France, one woman's beauty became both her crown and her curse. Her name was Isabeau de Lascelle, once called the Flower of Avignon. She was no witch, no heretic, yet the church branded her the devil's bride. What followed was not a trial of faith, but a ritual of destruction, where desire was judged as sin and love itself was punished by fire. This is the story they buried beneath the ashes of her name. In the spring of 1347, when the vineyards of Avignon shimmered like a sea of emerald, a young woman's laughter echoed through the courtyards of the Lascelle estate. Her name was Isabeau, daughter of a lesser nobleman whose family had survived the Crusades, but not prosperity. Yet where fortune failed her lineage, beauty restored its name. Her eyes held the hue of the rain at dusk, soft, deceptive, and endlessly deep. Men of the clergy called her blessed with grace. Poets called her the flower the sun follows. But behind admiration, envy brewed like storm clouds over the papal city. Avignon, then seat of the papacy, was no stranger to intrigue. Priests whispered power in dim cloisters while nobles bartered salvation for influence. The air smelled of incense and rot, of holiness masking hunger. Isabeau moved among these people like light across a tarnished altar, unaware that her very presence would one day be used as evidence against her. She was educated, unusually so. Her father, old Lord Guillaume, allowed her access to Latin texts, believing that beauty without knowledge was a fragile gift. But in a world where learning was a man's armor, Isabeau's wisdom became a weapon turned against her. "A woman who reads," said one bishop, "reads the devil's tongue." By 17, she was known across the Rhine Valley. Her portraits, painted by young apprentices of the papal ateliers, adorned noble halls. The sonnets written for her were copied in secret and sung in taverns. But praise in Avignon was often a prelude to ruin. With every compliment came suspicion, for no woman could shine so brightly without being touched by darkness. Her mother, Lady Emmeline, warned her, "The brighter the candle, the quicker the wax melts." Yet Isabeau only smiled, believing that kindness and truth would protect her. She did not yet understand that in the courts of men, purity was a myth traded for advantage. That summer, she attended a banquet at the palace of the Duke of Montreuil, a gathering meant to honor the arrival of papal envoys from Rome. The Duke was a man twice her age, revered and feared in equal measure. When his eyes fell upon her, the room seemed to pause. He spoke to her only once that night, yet by dawn, half the court whispered that the Duke had found a new obsession. Isabeau returned home unaware that her life had already shifted. Servants began to carry letters sealed with the Duke's crest. Rumors followed her to the market square, where women crossed themselves and men stared too long. The church, ever watchful, noted her growing influence. A woman adored by nobles and envied by priests was an anomaly, and anomalies demanded explanation. In Avignon, beauty needed permission. Charm required confession. That autumn, the vineyards turned red with harvest, and so did the gossip. Isabeau's name became a prayer on some lips and a curse on others. Beneath the cloisters of Saint Remy, a monk recorded in his ledger, "The Lady of Lascelle, beloved by many, watched by all." He did not know he was writing the first line of her damnation. In the months that followed the banquet, Avignon spoke of nothing but the Duke of Montreuil and the young Lady de Lascelle. It began with innocent courtesies, a letter sealed in gold, a carriage sent discreetly at dusk, and invitations to private masses no woman of her rank should have received. Yet every act of generosity was a chain, silk at first, then steel. The Duke, Avignon de Montreuil, was a man carved by war and ambition. His youth had been spent in the Crusades, his fortune built on blood and confiscated land. He possessed the kind of authority that silenced entire rooms, and the kind of loneliness that seeks to own what it cannot understand. When he met Isabeau, something within him fractured. To him, she was not a woman, but redemption given form. He wrote in his private journal, "She walks as if unaware of her power, and that unawareness wounds me." Isabeau resisted at first. Her father urged prudence, her mother whispered fear. "No man of power," Lady Emmeline warned, "gives affection without a price." But when the Duke began to visit under the pretense of charity, bringing physicians for her father's failing health, resistance seemed ungrateful. Gratitude became conversation. Conversation turned to confession. And confession, in time, became affection. Their meetings were held in the Duke's hunting lodge outside the city, a place so silent that even the wind seemed to hesitate. There, among tapestries of saints and martyrs, he swore eternal devotion. "You are my absolution," he told her, pressing her hand against the silver cross he wore upon his chest. "If God has sent me one mercy, it is you. But mercy, in the hands of powerful men, is a fragile thing." The Duke's affection soon turned possessive. He dismissed her servants and replaced them with his own, claiming it was for her safety. He forbade her from attending public gatherings without his escort. To Isabeau, it was devotion. To others, it was confinement gilded with tenderness. When she laughed with another man, even out of courtesy, the Duke's temper flickered like a storm beneath the calm of his voice. Soon, his household began to whisper. One maid was dismissed for speaking of Isabeau too fondly. Another was beaten for bringing her flowers from a local admirer. The Duke, once admired for his diplomacy, became known for his unpredictable silences. In the chapel of Montreuil, he ordered a private mass in her name. The priest who officiated later confessed that the Duke's prayer had chilled him. Etienne had knelt before the altar and said, "Let her soul be bound to mine in life and in death, even if heaven denies us both." That vow would echo far beyond the chapel walls. When rumors reached Avignon that Isabeau had become the Duke's mistress, the city divided. Some pitied her, a young girl caught in a nobleman's grasp. Others envied her, believing she had bewitched him with unnatural charm. The church took notice. A cardinal was heard to remark, "No man leaves the altar for a mortal woman without the whisper of the devil in his ear." By winter, Isabeau's name was spoken in the same breath as blasphemy. The Duke's obsession became public spectacle. Her virtue, public property. And in the eyes of the Inquisition, the line between love and heresy began to blur. The vow that had promised protection now marked her for ruin. By the spring of 1348, Isabeau's presence at court had grown impossible to ignore. The Duke's devotion, once discreet, now painted her across every hall of Avignon. Noblewomen whispered in velvet corridors, priests observed her with furrowed brows, and courtiers calculated alliances as though she were a battlefield. A woman of beauty and wit, standing in the midst of political currents, was a danger the church could neither sanction nor contain. It began subtly. Letters, unsigned yet unmistakable in tone, were left upon her dressing table, accusing her of seducing men with unnatural intent. Servants, loyal but fearful, reported priests murmuring that her laughter carried the devil's echo. Every glance from the Duke reinforced suspicion, as if her very eyes contained incantations. Yet Isabeau moved with composure, unaware of the storm coalescing around her. The court of Avignon thrived on secrets and shadows. Jealous wives of influential dukes traced her footsteps, recording her actions for hours, turning trivial courtesies into evidence of unholy schemes. Clerics, eager to curry favor with the papacy, catalogued her education, her knowledge of Latin, and even her choice of embroidery patterns, interpreting them as symbols of sorcery. It was a theater where perception became law, and her every breath was a witness against her. One evening, a trembling scribe delivered a letter to the Inquisition. Its ink smudged from hastily clasped hands. It accused Isabeau of enchantments of the flesh and consulting with spirits forbidden by God. It claimed she had bewitched the Duke of Montreuil, drawing him into illicit devotion, and that her influence threatened the sanctity of the city. By dawn, the letter circulated among inquisitors, its contents whispered in corridors where only shadows were meant to tread. Isabeau remained unaware. She attended Mass with a serene grace, bowing as if oblivious to the judgment silently gathering around her. Yet men and women alike recoiled at her presence, calling her temptation incarnate. In an age where sin could be observed as clearly as a mark upon the skin, her beauty itself became evidence of transgression. The Church's gaze turned from doctrine to obsession. What was once admiration now carried the weight of accusation. Rumors transformed into supposition, and supposition into judgment. Courtiers convened in private chambers, cataloging her gestures, her glances, her silences. "She smiles too freely," said one nobleman. "She knows too much," whispered a monk. The Duke's possession of her, once private and celebrated, now drew criticism and fear. A woman loved by a man of power was not just enviable. She was dangerous. By midsummer, the first formal inquiries were underway. The Inquisition demanded lists of witnesses, records of her interactions, and testimonies from servants who had observed her daily life. Each recounting was tinged with fear, malice, or ambition. Every detail, a touch, a glance, a whispered word, became evidence of an alleged conspiracy against God and man alike. In the shadows of the royal court, a pattern emerged. Admiration turns to envy, love to accusation, beauty to blasphemy. The pieces were now arranged. The trap was invisible but complete. The Church required only a spark to ignite the flames of public judgment. By autumn, Isabeau's name was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the whispers in the halls, to the notes on altars, to the eyes watching from the shadows. And in that darkness, the machinery of persecution began its quiet, inevitable turn. By the winter of 1348, whispers had hardened into accusation. The Inquisition, ever vigilant in Avignon, summoned Isabeau de Lascelle to the cathedral's chamber of confessions, a room painted with saints whose eyes seemed to watch every movement. The doors, heavy and carved with grotesque faces, closed behind her with a sound that echoed like a verdict. She was no longer merely the Duke's mistress or a noblewoman of beauty. She was a subject under God's judgment, and the men who waited inside claimed the authority of heaven itself. Her body bore subtle bruises, marks of her private encounters with the Duke that had been misinterpreted as evidence of lustful sorcery. When she knelt before the inquisitors, the ropes around her wrists were tightened with deliberate slowness, a ritual designed to break not the body alone, but the mind. The first priest, gaunt and pale, leaned close and murmured, "Confess, child, and your soul may yet be spared." Each denial brought a new turn of the wheel of agony known to those who survived these trials. Fingers cracked the joints of her hands, cords bit into her skin, and a quiet murmur of prayer masked the sound of her screams. The inquisitors dictated the words she was to speak. They carved confessions from her lips as if shaping clay. She repeated phrases that she had never thought, acknowledging dances with shadows and consultations with demons. Yet in her mind, she traced a different truth, a world where men wielded faith as an instrument of cruelty, where devotion became torment, and innocence was punished for the pride of others. Her own voice became a strange echo, foreign and alien. "I have bewitched the Duke. I have conjured spirits. I have danced at midnight with unholy forces." These were the words they forced upon her, yet they were not her own. Inwardly, she confessed to nothing but the anguish of being human in a society that demanded perfection from women while excusing male obsession. Every syllable spoken was a lie, yet each syllable carried the weight of condemnation. The inquisitors took meticulous notes, their hands steady while hers shook violently. One of them, a man named Father Arnaud, observed her with satisfaction. "The girl resists, yet she speaks," he whispered to his companion. "Even in agony, she falls under the devil's sway." They did not see the courage in her eyes, only the surface of fear and the compliance they required. Hours passed. The candle flames guttered as if exhausted by the room's darkness. The priests alternated between threats and false mercy, offering her an illusion of salvation if she repeated their script perfectly. By the time the confession ended, Isabeau's knees were raw, her back arched from the tension of the ropes, her lips cracked, yet her spirit remained intact in its quiet rebellion. Outside, the courtyard echoed with the distant sounds of the Duke's patrols, his servants unaware of the truth. They only knew the official narrative, that Isabeau had confessed to witchcraft, that her beauty was dangerous, that the devil had touched her soul. The room, heavy with incense and despair, had transformed her into an object, a story, a cautionary figure. She was led away not as a woman, but as a symbol. And in that silence, in the stillness of the confessional chamber, a seed was planted, one that would grow into fire, ashes, and a legacy of horror. The Duke of Montreuil, once a man of power and command, became a figure of quiet terror within his own halls. By the time Isabeau was dragged before the Inquisition, Etienne de Montreuil had made a choice that would echo through history. He abandoned her, not openly, not with violence, but with calculated silence. To preserve his lands, his title, and his reputation, he declared publicly that Isabeau was a woman touched by the devil, a seductress whose beauty concealed malice. In the eyes of the court, he was a paragon of piety. In the shadows of his chambers, he was a man who had traded love for survival. The court applauded his prudence. Nobles praised his devotion to God over fleshly temptation. Priests nodded in solemn approval. Yet within Montreuil's stone walls, the scent of her perfume lingered like smoke, haunting him in the empty corridors where servants dared not tread. His chambers, once filled with tapestries of saints and battles, now felt like tombs. Each night, he wandered them alone, recalling the soft laughter that had once brought him solace. He forbade mention of her name, yet he could not erase it from memory. Every echo of her presence, a stolen glance, a silk ribbon, the shadow of a window frame, reminded him of the choice he had made. He had condemned the only woman he had ever truly loved, and the weight of that decision pressed upon his chest like a stone. The Duke's advisors noticed the change immediately. A man who once negotiated treaties with the precision of a surgeon now walked with a tremor in his step. Letters were delayed, audiences postponed, and his temper grew brittle. Courtiers whispered that Montreuil had seen ghosts, that he spoke to empty halls, and that he wept alone at dawn. None of these rumors could penetrate the public facade he maintained, a facade of composure, devotion, and unassailable virtue. Yet the Duke's silence was deliberate. He refused to defend Isabeau, refused to protest her innocence, and refused to acknowledge his own complicity. His name remained untarnished, while hers was dragged through the courts, the cloisters, and the streets of Avignon. He had chosen safety over love, and in doing so, he had transformed a personal betrayal into historical erasure. In private, he confided only to himself. He walked the battlements at night, staring out over the rain, imagining her among the shadows of the city, imagining the screams that would soon mark her fate. Each imagined sound tore at him, yet he said nothing. The Duke had learned that silence could protect his lineage, but at the cost of everything human within him. Servants, sensing the Duke's torment, began to tread lightly, whispering that the halls were haunted not by spirits, but by guilt. The tapestries he had once admired now seemed accusatory, the cross upon his chest heavy with irony. Even the chapel offered no comfort. Every prayer seemed to bounce back from the vaulted ceiling as an accusation rather than absolution. By the time the Inquisition issued formal orders for her trial, Montreuil had perfected the art of detachment. His silence had protected his lands, his reputation, and his title. But it had also sealed Isabeau's fate. The woman who had once been the flower of Avignon was now condemned by those who should have loved her. And the man who had sworn devotion watched as the machinery of persecution began its inexorable march, powerless to intervene. In the end, the Duke's greatest sin was not cowardice alone, but the betrayal of a love that might have altered the course of her life, and in doing so, altered the course of history. The morning of the trial dawned cold and gray over Avignon. Cathedral bells tolled, as if in mourning, their vibrations echoing through cobblestone streets already thick with anticipation. By sunrise, the square was filled with nobles in embroidered silks, peasants in threadbare tunics, and priests in cassocks of black and white, all drawn together by the promise of witnessing divine judgment. In their eyes, Isabeau de Lascelle was no longer a woman. She was a spectacle, a lesson, a symbol of sin made flesh. Bound and shivering, Isabeau was led to the center of the square. Her wrists bore the faint rope burns from previous interrogations, and her dress, though plain, seemed to glow with the paradoxical radiance of innocence accused. The inquisitors took their places on a raised platform, their robes heavy with gold trim and the weight of authority. Among the crowd, murmurs spread. Some anticipated her punishment as justice, others as tragedy, but all knew that the outcome would be eternal, inscribed upon her soul. The chief inquisitor read the charges aloud with solemn precision. Fornication with the Duke of Montreal, heresy against the Church, witchcraft and manipulation of noble blood, the corrupting of men and women alike through deceit and charm. Every word fell like stone upon the square, echoing from wall to wall, marking her not just guilty in law, but guilty in the collective imagination of the city. Witnesses, those coerced, bribed, or simply fearful, recounted her life with selective accuracy. A smile at a feast became seduction. A whispered prayer became a spell. A glance at the Duke's face became evidence of possession. Even those who had loved her, including servants who had tended her since childhood, were silent. Fear, not malice, had sealed their tongues. As the inquisitors pronounced their final judgment, Isabeau was led to the stake. The ropes that bound her were thick, coarse, and unyielding, a physical echo of the spiritual condemnation she carried. The wood was stacked high, surrounded by pitch and kindling. She stood tall despite exhaustion, the wind tugging at her hair, and in that instant, the square seemed suspended, a moment between life and history, between humanity and ritualized cruelty. Flames were lit. At first, they lit the edges of the stake, casting elongated shadows of onlookers across the stone. Then they climbed higher, devouring the wood and smoke curling toward the heavens. The crowd's murmurs escalated into a rhythmic chant, part prayer, part frenzy, blending awe with fear. The scent of burning cloth and timber filled the air, mingling with the underlying tang of anticipation and dread. The inquisitors pronounced her purified, claiming that God's judgment had been fulfilled. Yet as the flames crept higher, the illusion of justice faltered. To many, her suffering transcended crime, and the line between devotion and cruelty blurred. Isabeau, once adored for beauty and intelligence, was now reduced to ashes, a lesson, a warning, and a cautionary tale. Even the Duke, safely distant, felt the reverberations. Though shielded by the public mask of piety, he would never forget the sight, nor the sound of her screams mingled with the crackle of fire. In that moment, love, sin, and vengeance fused into a spectacle that history would record in both horror and fascination. When the flames died down, only embers and smoke remained. The square was silent, save for the whispered prayers of those who had witnessed the power of fear, envy, and faith intertwined. Isabeau de Lascelle had been consumed, not by magic, not by sin, but by the relentless machinery of human cruelty. Dawn broke over Avignon with a muted light, struggling to penetrate the pall of smoke and sorrow that lingered in the cathedral square. The crowds had dispersed, leaving behind only the scorched earth and the smell of burnt timber. Amid the silence, a lone figure moved carefully through the ashes. Elaine, Isabeau's childhood handmaiden who had survived the chaos by hiding in the shadows. Her small hands, blackened with soot, gathered the remnants of a life erased from history. Within those ashes lay fragments of the woman she had loved and served, charred pieces of fabric, a delicate silver chain, and a scattering of letters, their ink smudged but still legible. These were Isabeau's words, never delivered, never heard by the Duke, never allowed to speak in court. Each letter was a confession of thought, not of sin. A testimony of love, despair, and truth. A human voice crushed by the machinery of power and faith. Elaine wept quietly as she read. In one letter, Isabeau described her devotion to the Duke, not as seduction, but as a shared longing for connection in a world that demanded subservience from women. In another, she recounted her fear of the Inquisition, not with self-pity, but with acute awareness of the hypocrisy surrounding her. Every line revealed intelligence and courage, a life fully lived yet judged and destroyed before its time. The handmaiden realized that these ashes carried more than the remains of a body. They carried the unspoken truth of a society built on appearances, fear, and control. The church had painted her as a witch, the Duke had forsaken her, and the court had cheered. Yet the letters told a different story, of a young woman who had dared to live and to love, even in the shadow of inevitable persecution. Elaine tucked the fragments into a small wooden box, whispering a promise to preserve them. They must know who she truly was, she murmured. She understood that history would never forgive, that those in power preferred stories that punished women for beauty and wit. Still, she carried the burden of memory, ensuring that even if the world forgot, the truth would survive in secret. Outside the ruined square, Avignon carried on. Merchants swept ash from the streets, priests chanted their morning prayers, and the Duke of Montreuil went about his duties, untouched by public scrutiny. No one questioned the official narrative, that Isabeau had been consumed by the fires of justice. Few knew that the embers held stories of love, courage, and defiance. Elaine's own life would be defined by this secret. She became silent witness to a crime that the world celebrated as divine intervention. Every day, she returned to the ashes in her mind, reconstructing the woman she had loved, piece by fragile piece. Her loyalty became a quiet rebellion, a testament to humanity where institutions had failed. In the shadows of history, Isabeau's letters remained hidden, a whisper preserved against centuries of erasure. They spoke not of witchcraft, but of the cruelty that men could inflict under the guise of law and piety. In death, she had become a cautionary figure. In these ashes, she retained her dignity, her intellect, and her voice. Through Elaine's hands, the story of Isabeau survived, not in public records, not in court testimonies, not in sermons, but in quiet testament to a woman wronged, a love betrayed, and a truth too dangerous for the eyes of power. The days after Isabeau's execution transformed the Duke of Montreuil from a figure of authority into a haunted shadow. Etienne withdrew entirely from the world he once commanded, retreating into the high towers and long corridors of his chateau. Servants whispered among themselves, saying that he wandered by night, calling her name in half-formed sentences, as if expecting her to answer from the shadows. No candle dared burn in his chambers. He claimed that every flame was the resurrection of her face, dancing and mocking him in flickering terror. The Duke's mind, once sharp with strategy and diplomacy, fragmented under the weight of guilt and obsession. His speech became fragmented, prayers turning to murmured confessions no priest could absolve. "She was no witch," he muttered in the dead hours, pacing the cold halls. "I was the one bewitched." His words, spoken to empty rooms and trembling walls, revealed the depth of his self-condemnation. He no longer saw the world as a court or a kingdom, only as a theater of punishment for a crime he could not undo. Servants began to speak of strange rituals, rooms left untouched for years, meals taken in silence, tapestries untouched as though any disturbance might disturb her presence. When the Duke moved through the halls, the air seemed to bend around him, carrying the echo of the screams he had once heard. The last, piercing cry of Isabeau as flames consumed her. No man, he realized, could distance himself from such horror and remain unmarked. Letters from other nobles were ignored. His lands became neglected. Alliances faltered. Montreal's power, once unquestionable, eroded silently as his obsession deepened. Visitors reported hearing him whispering to walls, conversations with her memory, commands for her return, questions he knew would never be answered. Some swore they saw him standing before the empty stake where she had perished, gesturing as if to shield her from the wind, as if the fire had never taken her. In moments of lucidity, he penned confessions, letters he never sent, acknowledging his complicity in her demise. "I chose reputation over love, obedience over truth," he wrote. "In burning her, I have burned myself. No absolution can reach the soul I destroyed." The ink often smudged as tears fell upon the page, marking the fragile evidence of a man undone by power, fear, and guilt. Montreal forbade all fires within his estates, claiming that even a hearth could conjure visions of Isabeau's suffering. Servants, fearing both God and the Duke, obeyed in silence, watching as he spiraled into nocturnal wanderings and obsessive prayers. Every shadow in the shadow became her, every sound a whisper of accusation, and every candleless chamber a tomb of remorse. By the end of the year, the Duke was a ghost among men, known less for his titles than for the madness that enveloped him. Courtiers dared not speak of him openly. Priests hesitated at the threshold of his presence. Even history would later regard him with a strange blend of pity and horror, a man whose devotion to survival had led to the destruction of both the woman he loved and himself. In the silence of Montreal's castle, surrounded by darkness and memories of flames, he confessed aloud, finally, to the truth that had consumed him. "She was no witch, I was." But in those words lay no salvation, only a record of guilt that would endure beyond his years. Years after Isabeau's death, the city of Avignon had settled into a fragile rhythm of daily life, as if the memory of the fire and smoke had been carefully buried beneath stone and prayer. Yet history, as it often does, leaves traces in the unlikeliest of places. In the dim library of the Abbey of St. Pierre, a young monk named Brother Lawrence stumbled upon a document, so carefully hidden that centuries of dust had settled over its secrecy. The manuscript, bound in leather darkened with age, bore the handwriting of Father Arnaud, the inquisitor who had overseen Isabeau's trial. Its opening lines seemed innocuous, a chronicle of daily proceedings in Avignon. But as Laurent read further, he realized the account contradicted the official records. Testimonies had been altered, confessions fabricated, and the charges against Isabeau, fornication, witchcraft, heresy, were manipulated to serve political ends. The true objective, Father Arnaud admitted in guarded passages, had been the seizure of the Montreal estates, a prize more valuable than any moral victory. The monk's hands trembled as he turned the brittle pages. The record described with chilling clarity the orchestration of the trial, letters planted, witnesses coerced, and the Duke's silence leveraged as evidence of Isabeau's supposed guilt. "We are instruments of God and men alike," the Inquisitor wrote. "Yet power, cloaked in piety, is our greatest ally. Truth is a luxury that history cannot afford." Lawrence's mind raced. The Church had claimed justice. The court had applauded. The city had witnessed flames as a divine lesson. Yet in this hidden chronicle lay the evidence of betrayal, manipulation, and the calculated destruction of an innocent woman. He realized that the story passed down in sermons, court records, and gossip was a facade, a carefully constructed narrative to sanctify theft and preserve the reputation of the powerful. Fear gripped him. The abbey had always been a place of vigilance, where even a whisper of dissent could lead to excommunication. To reveal the chronicle would be to challenge Rome itself. Yet to hide it felt like complicity in the same crime that had consumed Isabeau. He read passages aloud only to himself, voices mingling with candlelight, imagining her words unspoken, her letters never delivered, and her life erased by ambition masquerading as faith. Despite the monk's resolve to preserve the truth, he understood its fragility. Within weeks, instructions arrived from the cardinal's office in Rome. The manuscript was to be returned to the archives, sealed, and its existence never mentioned. Any attempt to publicize the document would be met with excommunication or worse. Laurent obeyed silently, burying the chronicle beneath layers of stone and locked doors, a secret entrusted to shadows rather than history. Outside, Avignon carried on, the city unaware that the fire which had consumed Isabeau had been followed by another, subtler act of erasure, the rewriting of memory. Rumors persisted, of course, whispered in markets and cloisters, tales of a woman burned unjustly, a duke undone by guilt, and a church's quiet machinations. But those who knew the truth, Laurent among them, were powerless to speak without peril. Thus, history preserved her not in fact, but in rumor. The city's ghosts whispered of injustice where archives remained silent. And in those rumors, fragile though they were, Isabeau's story survived, unrecorded, unacknowledged, yet enduring, a testament to the power of memory over authority, of truth against silence. In the decades following the trial, Isabeau de Lascelle became legend, though not in the form she might have imagined. Her life, extinguished in flames, transformed into myth. Sermons invoked her name as a warning, a moral tale of feminine temptation and the peril of desire. Painters and scribes depicted her likeness with exaggerated features, a figure both beautiful and sinister, a cautionary emblem of seduction that demanded fear rather than understanding. The city of Avignon carried the weight of her memory as both truth and fable, a conflation that would endure for centuries. She was called the Devil's Bride, a title that echoed in cloisters, marketplaces, and noble courts alike. Mothers warned daughters of her supposed sins, while scholars debated whether her intellect had led her to the flames. In reality, the name obscured the tragedy, concealing the deliberate cruelty of those who wielded faith as an instrument of power. History, shaped by fire and silence, painted her not as a victim of human malice but as a cautionary story, a woman whose beauty threatened a world already fragile with envy and ambition. Yet beneath the ashes of legend, the truth persisted. Carried quietly by those who had known her or glimpsed her letters, a young woman of extraordinary courage, whose only crime was to defy societal expectation and the possessive obsession of a man whose love had become tyranny. In the secrecy of hidden archives, in whispered rumors among monks and servants, Isabeau's real story endured, the story of innocence crushed beneath ambition, devotion, and fear. Her name, invoked for centuries, also became a mirror. It reflected the paradoxes of human society, the veneration of piety, the vilification of autonomy, and the willingness to destroy love in the guise of justice. The Duke of Montreal's madness, the court's complicity, and the Inquisition's calculated cruelty coalesced into a narrative that elevated her death to myth. Yet myth, in this case, could not entirely erase the raw humanity of her existence. Even in absence, she influenced those who remembered her. Scholars piecing together her letters, servants safeguarding her memory, and monks aware of the forbidden chronicle all bore witness to a reality that Rome would never sanction. Her story persisted in rumor and memory, a caution not of seduction, but of injustice. The capacity of men to burn not only women, but love itself in the name of God. In Avignon, the ruins of her world still whisper her presence. Winds carry the faint scent of smoke and roses across abandoned courtyards, through the arches of monasteries and along the stone streets where the square once burned with both fire and attention. Travelers and residents, unaware of her true history, sense the shadow of a woman whose life was claimed not by supernatural forces, but by the cruelty and ambition of men. In the end, Isabeau de Lascelle survived through silence, through the ashes, and through the fragments of her letters. She outlived the lies of the church, the madness of the duke, and the apathy of the court. The title "The Devil's Bride" may have branded her in history, but it could never capture the truth that in a world ruled by fear and obsession, the purest crime of all is to be alive, to love, and to be denied justice. Her story, though ended in fire, lives on as a testament to human cruelty, the resilience of memory, and the haunting legacy of a woman who was, in death, more powerful than in life. The Bride of the Devil remains not a villain, but a witness, a spectral voice reminding us that the flames of history often consume the innocent, leaving only shadows and whispers to tell the truth.